Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at the Dornier Do 31. The aircraft recently released as Local Legend 15, I believe in collaboration with iniBuilds, and I doubt it's an aircraft that many of us would have guessed, but certainly makes for a very interesting prospect within the sim. For those of you not familiar with the aircraft, the Do 31 was an experimental jet-propelled vertical takeoff and landing cargo aircraft. Designed and produced by West German manufacturer Dornier, the aircraft to this day is a unique machine in terms of its capabilities. The Do 31 is an absolute powerhouse, fitted with two Rolls-Royce Pegasus engines, the same engine you find on a Harrier, another four Rolls-Royce RB162 vertical lift engines mounted on each wing. Essentially, this peculiar looking machine, which to me looks like somewhat of a cross between an IL-18 and a Hummingbird, is a lightweight C-130 with a Harrier strapped under each wing. For our flight, we're currently on the ground at Oberpfaffenhofen, the home and testing facility of Dornier. We're going to be recreating a previous real-world ferry flight, taking the aircraft from just outside of Munich over towards Paris Le Bourget for the 1969 Paris Air Show. We've adjusted our route slightly. We're going to be flying overhead Friedrichshafen en route. The real-world Do 31 now located at the Dornier Aircraft Museum in Friedrichshafen. As always, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to help support the channel further, you can also do so by becoming a channel member or patron. So this morning then we find ourselves on the ground at Oberpfaffenhofen, the Dornier test facility, in the cockpit of the Do 31. As ever, iniBuilds certainly know how to build a beautiful aircraft. The same is certainly true internally. A very nice level of attention to detail on the texturing and the modelling, as you can see. Behind us we have the main cargo compartment. We also have the Do 960 computer, which, rather interestingly, I believe it's the first of its type. It's a hybrid analog digital computer, and essentially we need all of that computing power on board to crunch the numbers, allowing this lumbering beast to get into the hover. We have 10 engines as well on board the jets. And despite that rank of gauges, starting up the aircraft actually relatively easy, relatively straightforward, and actually a fairly quick process. As usual, we are going to be using the provided checklist, albeit I have added a few extra steps in along the way. I think there's a few omissions currently with the checklist. We've already run through the preliminary cockpit preparation, so for the engine start, the battery master can go on, up to the top of the overhead panel, and battery master is selected on. The parking brake is set. Pretty nice sounds on the aircraft overall, at least internally, as you'll hear as we go. In terms of the fuel pumps, the manual doesn't outline very much there in terms of what's required, but we do have the start and landing pump down the back, pump 5 and pump 8, so I've just elected to turn those on. We'll take the beacon light on, again back up to the top of the overhead, anti-collision light is selected on. The engine start switch is located down the back of the centre console, so we'll open up the engine start cover. Take the engine 1 master switch on, same there as well for the engine 1 ignition switch, and finally we can hit the engine 1 starter. Okay, so as you can see, we now got a good start here on engine 1. The engine's stable. We'll take the engine 1 start switch off. Same now on engine 2. We'll take the engine 2 master switch on. Same there again for the engine 2 ignition. And we'll engage the starter. So down to the engine gauges, we're looking for at least 18% here on the N2 before we introduce the fuel. Interestingly, I think a little bit of a modelling error there. You can see the main needle pointing through to the 10s there on the percentage, which is correct, but the small needle there as well, also indicating in the 10% range. Typically, the smaller the needle on such a gauge would be indicating 1% increments. Anyway, there's 20%. We'll introduce fuel here on the right engine. We do have a light off. We're waiting until we see 300 degrees here on the exhaust gas temperature before we disengage the engine starter. They're just coming up through 200. And there's 300. So we can disconnect the starter. We'll close up the engine start cover. And again, just monitoring the gauges here until the engine stabilizes. And looks as though we should see N2 stable there around 65%. Okay, so we do have two good starts there on the main engines. For the vertical engine start, first things first, just ensuring the conventional engines are running. They both are. The co-pilot vertical engine control, we'll select that on. We're looking for a green light, which we have. The vertical engine throttle lever is in the start position. According to the checklist, we want to wait here until the engines spool up, but they seem to always be in a somewhat spooled up state. You can see they're currently showing around 2500 RPM. I don't know whether or not that's true to life of the aircraft. It could potentially make sense, although we have RPM with no EGT there, which is a little bit strange. Anyway, the engines have started to spool, so we'll introduce the fuel both on the left side and the right. And you can see as we do so there, those hover engines continuing to spool up. Those EGTs coming up there as well. So again, just monitoring the pressures and temperatures here until the engines are stable. And those EGTs coming up fairly rapidly now, peaking around 700 degrees. And it looks as though we do have a good start. So once again, for the conventional engines, the throttles are in the idle position. According to the checklist, we can enable the co-pilot assist mode as required. You have various levels of assist on the aircraft, basically all the way through from most realistic with the assists turned off, right through to something a little bit easier with a lot of stability augmentation on the aircraft. The after start checks will take on the engine generators. Interestingly, another little potential modelling error here. We've got generator 1, 2, 3 and 4, but the lights are in a different sequence there. You've got 1, 2, 3 and 4. That could be true to life for an aircraft of this generation, but it would still be a little bit strange. So we have all 4 generators selected on. We'll take now all of the main fuel pumps, again not mentioned in the checklist. That seems like a logical time to do it. And we'll just take off the start and landing pumps. Engine 1 and 2 starter switches are once again off. The engine start cover is guarded. With the nav radio setup, we're initially going to be tracking out towards the Kempton Kilo Papa Tango VOR. That's on a frequency of 108.4. So coming up to the Navcom radio, selecting nav, and we want 108.4. Looks like we're already picking that up, showing 42 miles to run towards the station. We're going to be tracking inbound on a course of 238. So we'll set that here ahead of time. Just using my hardware binding to do so, it's a little bit quicker. There's 238 on the CDI. Set 238 here as well on the heading bug. As you can see, we're going to be departing out to the southwest, and we're actually pretty much going to be departing straight out on the southwesterly runway. So nav radio is set, the HSI is set, transponder will set through to out. The taxi and lineup checklist, the lights, for some peculiar reason the taxi light not modelled on the aircraft, so we'll just take the landing lights on. Same as well for the de-icing systems, they're not currently modelled, not really sure why. We may encounter some icing later on, so we'll take a look at those as we go along. Anyway, the lights are set, we'll just hold the brakes a moment longer. The DO31 does rely quite heavily on the automated co-pilot assistance here, so for example you can see we can't actually actuate the nozzle levers here on the main engines ourselves. That means we're going to be taxiing straight ahead with full idle thrust on those 2 Pegasus engines. And as you'll see, the aircraft is going to pick up quite a bit of speed as we do that. Anyway, we'll come off the brakes. Fairly long taxi here ahead of us. Again, we're going to be taxiing out for the southwesterly runway for our departure. So we'll continue for now here in the taxi, and I'll come back to you again once we're down at the runway threshold. Okay, so we've now got ourselves lined up on Oberpfaffenhofen's runway 22. Again, the aircraft will pick up a lot of speed there during the taxi, so you do rather have to ride the brakes. In terms of thrust, we do have an excess of thrust on board, as I mentioned. We've got around 66,000 pounds of thrust available, but do just bear in mind you will need to get the aircraft well below that weight if you want to enter into the hover in a reasonable fashion. Anyway, in terms of the hover takeoff checks, ATC clearance has been confirmed. Again, just checking the parameters there of both our conventional and our vertical lift engines. The co-pilot vertical engine control, again selected on with a green light. Co-pilot assists have been selected off. The checklist calls for the park brake to be on here during the hover takeoff, which to me seems a little bit strange. If we miss that later on during the landing, we're going to scrub the tyres, so we'll take the park brake off and just hold the jet here on the brakes. We'll leave the conventional throttles here at idle. We're going to be actuating the vertical lift engine throttles, and as you'll see, our co-pilot will effectively manage the main engines both in terms of power output and nozzle angle here during the takeoff. So just starting to come up on that vertical lift throttle, and again I'm not moving the main throttles or the nozzles there, that's our co-pilot assist. There's no option to do that manually, unfortunately, on the aircraft, which is a little bit of a shame, although it would be awfully complex for one person to do. Okay, so nozzle angle there around 50 degrees. Engine temperatures and pressures looking good. We'll continue to come up on the vertical lift engines. One slight, I assume, issue that I've had with the aircraft to date, it will creep forward on the brakes at high power settings, which seems a little bit unlikely to me. You can come fully back on the stick to arrest that forward momentum, but that does mean your transition into the hover will also be potentially a little bit more haphazard. Okay, so 90 degrees there now on the nozzles, just shy of full power on the vertical lift engines. And as you can see, even with all of that thrust, the DO31 fairly leisurely in terms of getting into the air. And the aircraft is a nice little handful on the controls. Manageable, but certainly a little bit of a challenge and takes a little bit of getting used to. Anyway, we do have a positive climb, take the gear up. So for now, just maintaining full power on the vertical lift engines, pitching the nose down slightly to build up a little bit of forward speed. Almost a little bit like a helicopter here, pitching down to get what is effectively the same as a bit of transitional lift off the wings. And I find it's best to build up as much speed as you can here before you transition out of the hover. The aircraft does have slightly strange flight modelling behaviour as you transition between the hover and forward flight. Similarly as well, I've found that as you bring up the main engines, which we'll do in just a moment's time, for some reason the jet wants to pitch nose down and also tends to bring the right wing down at the same time. I've no idea why that's the case. I've had a bit of a think about it. I can't think of any decent aerodynamic reasons. So you can see there, as I feed in the throttle, that's inducing a pitch down and a bank input out to the right. So just feeding in those main engines very slowly for now. We want to be up above 150 knots here before we start thinking about reducing the power on the vertical lift engines. As we come up on the main engines needing more forward pressure on the stick, we've now got full forward pressure and just about maintaining a level attitude. Still in a slight climb. Approaching 150 knots, so we'll start backing off those vertical lift engines. And as with most things that hover, the slower and smoother you can do everything here, the better you'll find things in terms of the transition. So about 50% now on the vertical lift engines, continuing to come up on the main engines. And once more, as we do so, experiencing that bank out to the right, the aircraft wanting to pitch nose down. It's still very controllable, but it does take a little bit of getting used to. And as I say, I can't really think of any good reason why the aircraft would behave in such a fashion. So again, those are not my control inputs. That's the flight model behavior, as I said, a little bit clunky from the transition out of the hovering into forward flight. Just approaching 200 knots. So we do have gear up and flaps retracted. All the way back now to idle thrust on the vertical lift engines. It's continuing to come up on the mains. Up through about 80% now on the M1. And we'll just hold off on the after takeoff checks here until we're established nicely in the climb, potentially even in the cruise. So as I say, those movements that you can see from the aircraft currently, they're not weather induced, they're not induced by myself either. That is the transition between the two states of the flight model. As you can see, our co-pilot vertical engine control light is now out. So the co-pilot automatically cutting the vertical lift engines for us at the appropriate phase. We'll maintain about 200 knots here in the climb. Go with around 90% here on the M1. And looking pretty good on the heading for now, doing about 240 degrees. Just slightly left of track, inbound towards the Kempton VOR. As we mentioned, an abundance of thrust here on the DO31. So we're getting around 3,000, 3,500 feet per minute rate of climb on the vertical speed indicator currently. That's to be expected. We've got way more thrust than we need, which ultimately was a bit of an issue with the aircraft. And indeed with most aircraft able to hover. You end up carrying a lot more power and also a lot more weight than you might otherwise need. Having watched the iniBuilds video, I believe the DO31 has a thrust to weight ratio of around 1.2. Whereas your typical passenger jet, the 310 they mentioned, for example, I believe it was around 0.2, so that gives you some idea just how different the two aircraft are in terms of performance. Okay, coming up through 9,000, we're going to level off at 10. So we'll start reducing that vertical speed. Trimming for that. I do have to say, once the aircraft is established in normal flight, it actually flies quite nicely. Somewhat more towards the default end of the spectrum in terms of how it feels, but it's nice and smooth on the controls. A little bit of weight there as well. Very easy to trim out, very easy as well to control the speed. So an easy aircraft to hand fly, and as a result very enjoyable I find to hand fly. So we're showing about another 30 miles here towards the VOR. We'll get the aircraft established in the cruise, trimmed out, we'll get the autopilot in. Worth mentioning that the DO31 does come with an autopilot, which is a nice feature. Ideal for those slightly long hops. And you can get a pretty decent speed out of the aircraft as well. We're doing about 250 knots currently, although we're going to start coming back on the power. I find around 10,000 feet, about 80% on the M1s gives you a pretty good cruise speed, around 250 knots or thereabouts. So we're just going to get trimmed out. And looking pretty good here now in trim, hands off the controls. And you can see the aircraft, again, pretty easy to hand fly. In terms of the autopilot then, we'll put in all 4 control channels. A little bit snappy there initially. Come into altitude hold. We'll go heading hold as well. The aircraft can be a little bit aggressive initially on the out-hold capture. It really just depends on what phase you get that in. It can pick it up quite nicely sometimes, but here you can see we're going to do a little bit of a dirty dive to get back down towards 10,000 feet. So if for whatever reason you want to fly the aircraft on something like VATSIM, you would need to be a little bit careful. So we'll just reduce that power slightly further back towards 80%. Doing about 280 knots at the moment, but again that is with the aircraft in a shallow descent. Take the flight directors on here as well. The climb checks, the gear is up, lights are out, flaps are up, landing lights can come off. So we'll put them into the retract position first of all. And you can see they have now retracted. So we'll take the switches through to off. Trims are set as required. The co-pilot vertical engine control is selected off, light is out. And again, power settings are looking good. Nicely established here now on the radial, so we'll adjust the heading, showing 20 miles to run. We've got about an hour and a half here in the cruise. Initially, as I mentioned during the introduction, we're going to be making our way overhead Friedrichshafen. See if we can't spot the field. Maybe even spot the real-world DO31 en route. The aircraft though is now nicely established during the cruise, maintaining our selected altitude and our selected heading. We do also have a nav capture mode should we so wish. You can see we are just picking up a little bit of icing here currently, and nothing we can do about that. As I say, on the aircraft, for whatever reason at the moment, the nacelle de-ice, same for the windshield de-ice, is not currently working. Of course that is a feature that would be really nice to see completed added to the aircraft. It is fairly essential for an aircraft that can potentially get up to around 35,000 feet. Anyway, one thing that I absolutely love about the Dornier is the panoramic view that you get with this cockpit. So we're going to sit back, relax, we'll enjoy that view en route. Initially we're going to be paralleling the Alps, we'll then make a turn out towards the northwest. As I say, about an hour and a half in terms of flight time. Range is not one of the DO31's particular strengths, but we can complete this flight on around 50% fuel capacity. In the meantime then, enjoy the views, enjoy this quirky aircraft. I'll come back somewhere outside of Paris, we'll talk through a few more features of the aircraft, and then we'll bring ourselves in for a vertical landing into Le Bourget. So, welcome back to the flight deck of the DO31. As you can see, a little bit of inclement weather here outside the outskirts of the city of Paris. We're just approaching runway 27 here at Le Bourget, just coming onto the localizer, so we'll start tracking that inbound. We've already got that set up, the final approach course 264, and the frequency there 110.55. We're just going to use the ILS here to get us down through this weather, and then we'll fly the rest of the approach, of course, manually. So 5,000 feet, 20 miles to run, still just a touch low here on the glide. A little bit faster as well, so we'll start coming back off the power. We want to reduce our speed back towards, for now, around 220 knots. In terms of the initial items for the landing checklist, the landing lights are selected on. Main engines are checked. We're waiting on a 5 nautical mile final here until we transition into the hover, so we'll hold the rest of the checklist for now. And we'll fly the approach here manually, just to get more of a feel for that flight model once again. So we'll take the autopilot out, and we'll take the flight director off. Just come onto the glide, so we'll put the aircraft into a shallow descent. 5,000 feet, 15 miles, looks good in terms of the profile. And tracking nicely now on that localizer. Again, just using the ILS until we're visual with the field. But as you can see, there is a little bit of weather between us and Le Bourget. We're doing about 220 knots over the ground currently, so we need around 1,000 feet per minute here on the vertical speed to maintain the glide slope. So the checklist calls at 3 miles. We'll transition out of conventional flight into the hover, but we'll probably get things set up a little bit ahead of time. Of course, not being all that familiar with the aircraft. Probably aiming for around 5 miles. For now, we want between 220 and 180 knots, so maintaining 220. We can take the gear down below 205 knots. The flaps actually have a pretty high limit speed there. We can take those down anywhere up to 260 knots. So we might just start taking the flap. We'll go through to flaps 15 initially. Just giving us a little bit more drag, helping keep that speed in check. Obviously later on the flaps aren't going to be much use in terms of creating any lift once we're in the hover, but nevertheless still useful just in terms of creating some drag and helping get that speed back. So back through 200 knots now. The aircraft pretty heavy here in pitch as we come off the power. Unsurprisingly, the DO31 really wants to drop like a bit of a brick with the power off. 10 miles to run, 3,500 feet, just a touch high, so correcting that. Still happy with where we are, there's 180 knots. Good now on the speed. Again, just a little bit ahead of time, we'll take the co-pilot vertical engine control on. There's our green light. So as before, the co-pilot there will control the main thrust down the nozzles once we come up on the vertical lift controls. In terms of our fuel state, as you might expect, the Dornier is a pretty thirsty aircraft. We're down to around 700 kilos now there in the main tank. So not a whole lot of fuel left, but enough certainly for the approach. And the nose just wanting to pitch up a little bit there, so countering that, putting us slightly higher here on the glide. 3,000 feet, 8 miles. Just about visual now with the runway lighting, but we'll maintain the ILS for now. And we are trending a little bit high, so back off that power. If anything, we actually want to be making a fairly shallow approach here to runway 27. Find that much easier for transitioning into the hover. So as soon as we're happy that we're completely visual with the runway, we'll start thinking about that transition. Start bleeding off that speed. We'll come through to flaps 30. And we'll take the gear down. We are below 205 knots. Back up on the power to maintain the speed. And again, at the moment, as you'd expect, just flying the aircraft conventionally as you would any other jet. I'd say the DO31 overall not a bad aircraft hand fly. Does require an awful lot of trim and pitch, but otherwise reasonable on the controls. Still getting that slightly weird, twitchy flight model behaviour. At the moment the aircraft is wanting to pick up the right wing. Okay, back on the glide, just approaching 4 miles. So we'll just start to come up on those vertical lift engines. You can see the nose pitching up there as we do so. And as I come back off the main engines there, again that right wing dropping. Okay, so speed reducing now back towards 120 knots. High here on the Pappy. There's idle on the main engines. So again we've got gear down 3 greens, we'll go through to flaps full, with the drag more than anything. And we're definitely a little bit high here at the moment. So back off the vertical lift engines, that's going to allow us to get a nice high descent rate back towards a reasonable profile. Again, if anything, we want to be below the Pappy, below the glide, just to allow us to really transition into that hover. We can use that last little bit of distance to bleed off the speed. And as I say, as best I can, I'll aim to have us touching down within the touchdown zone on the runway. Just a slight amount of rain, no need for the wipers. The wipers do physically operate on the aircraft, as you might expect from the sim. Okay, so 90 knots now on the speed. Just using a little bit more aft trim to ease up on those control forces. And as you can see, generally the DO31 pretty stable, easy enough to fly at the moment. Edging our way in towards the runway. There's 80. Just going to come slightly up again on those vertical lift engines, dip the nose down, build up a little bit more speed, just bring us inbound towards the runway tiny bit more expeditiously. So 3 whites, 1 red now on the Pappy. We'll keep that for now, we've got those industrial buildings off the nose. Once we're over the top of them, we'll dip down below the glide slope. So as before, I'm just using the one axis here to control the vertical lift engines, the co-pilot operating the main engines and the nozzles. So reducing a lot of the workload here associated with flying the aircraft. Okay, just clearing those buildings, so we'll trend a little bit low, start reducing that speed further. Back off the stick to do so. Bunch of aft trim there as well. Approaching 50 knots. And increasing there on the vertical lift engines. Definitely takes quite a bit of mental capacity to fly the aircraft. It's good fun, as you can see. And so far no particularly peculiar behaviours. So nicely into the hover over the touchdown zone. Start reducing that vertical lift, and we're down. Onto the brakes, cut the vertical lift engines, and overall for a first day landing, pretty happy with that result in the touchdown zone, and a fairly smooth landing there as well. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our outing in Local Legend 15, the iniBuilds Dornier Do. Certainly the aircraft is a very interesting product overall and something I've never seen in the sim before. I think overall quite a welcome addition. Again, very reasonably priced, so whilst the aircraft is not perfect by any means, I think you can forgive a lot of faults given the cost of the product. As usual though, I'll break things down just a little bit more, give you some details of what I think of the aircraft. Starting with the visual modelling. Overall, not much I can fault there, I'm sure it probably came across in the video, but the aircraft is beautiful both externally and internally. I really love the level of attention to visual detail, it really helps to bring the aircraft back to life. No flying examples of the Do-31 still, of course, currently in existence. One gripe with the visual externals of the aircraft, although I'm sure somebody over on flightsim.to will correct it, but it did seem as though the aircraft was lacking some historical markings. Otherwise though, again, excellent texturing and modelling, something that we've really come to expect from iniBuilds. It's actually quite impressive how quickly they can turn around a beautiful visual model. The flight model is certainly a very interesting category to touch on here today. Obviously I have nothing to compare the aircraft to. Probably the closest frame of reference that I have is the Harrier within DCS. Obviously a very different aircraft overall, but nevertheless same principle, both using Pegasus engines and combinations of power and nozzle angle to put the aircraft into the hover. Generally speaking, the Do-31 felt pretty good in the hover, fairly convincing, nice on the controls and certainly a little bit of a handful as well. The same in the cruise. Generally the aircraft felt pretty good. It can though just run away from you a little bit in pitch. Where the flight model does tend to fall apart a little bit is the transition from hover into conventional flight. At that point you do get some strange behaviours, notably quite a bit of twitchiness. The flight model almost feels a little bit digital at that point, and again, as you come up on the main power as well, the aircraft seems to want to drop the right wing, drop the nose, I'm not quite sure why. So things don't feel all that natural at that point in the experience. It's certainly an area of the aircraft that could still use some work. Do bear in mind though, once again, we are looking at an aircraft that costs roughly £10, and again is probably pushing the limits of what the sim is really capable of in terms of its flight modelling. So I think generally iniBuilds have actually done quite a nice job with the Do-31. I do hope though that they will continue to work on and improve the flight model of the aircraft. The aircraft systems are one of the weaker aspects of the product, quite a few discrepancies and omissions there. For example, we noted no taxi light available, not necessarily a huge deal, but also no anti-ice systems available. Those sorts of systems would be very easy to implement and they're prevalent even on default aircraft within the sim. Of course though, as we've seen, all of the main systems that you really need to operate the aircraft do function. It would of course be nice to see more systems depth, but for me I'm not sure it's an area that drastically needs attention. Clearly the Dornier 31 not looking to offer a study level experience. One area of the aircraft that could certainly use some work though are the sounds. Really good sounds internally, particularly with regards to the cockpit controls. I didn't find any switches, any animations with any missing sounds. The engine sounds internally as well, decent enough, which is more I can say for the externals of the aircraft. As you'll have seen from the external shots, the engines sound pretty poor. Another aircraft in the sim where the wind noise actually trumps the engine noise. Again, I don't have any direct frame of reference to the Do-31, but I'm sure many of you, myself included, will have seen a Harrier at some point at an air show. You'll no doubt have noticed just how noisy and also unique sounding the Pegasus jet engine can be. So imagine two of those strapped to an aircraft. I was really expecting a much greater cacophony of noise and a more recognisable sound overall. Extra features included with the product are fairly minimal, but again we are looking at a sub £10 product. The default camera views are generally decent, although the cockpit camera has a significant fisheye effect. I had to zoom in to around 75% to negate that. One feature that was missing, would have been nice to see, iniBuilds did include it with their AN225, no onboard visible cargo. There was an onboard tablet, but again very limited options, just a moving map, the ability to add or remove the pitot probe, as well as to open and close the aft cargo door. As best I can tell there was no way to operate, open or close the crew door. No visible chocks, no visible covers, no ability to add or remove a co-pilot. Again, features we've typically become rather accustomed to in the sim. And whilst the Dornier 31 is pretty cheap, again, it's obviously not going for that study level niche, so it is nice to have more features to pad out the overall experience. The documentation included with the aircraft is reasonably decent. You get a full paper checklist as well as inbuilt sim checklists. There are some discrepancies between the two, and as I mentioned, I think also a few omissions in both. Enough there though to help you get the aircraft started up. The same is true of the manual. It does explain the basic operation of the Do-31, but there are also certainly quite a few areas which aren't covered, areas where I just had to make my own best educated guess. Lastly, touching on the aircraft's FPS, it is worth noting I've now switched through to DLSS frame generation, so I do have my frame rate capped. I turned off DLSS for the FPS measurement, however I still capped my frame rate at 60. I was getting about 51 FPS with the Do-31 versus 60 plus with the default Cessna 152. In short then, for me the Dornier 31, overall a very nice offering. Not an aircraft that I knew I needed in the sim, but certainly a very interesting add-on from a historical point of view. I think, again taking the price into consideration, that iniBuilds have done a very nice job with the Do-31. Again, it could use some tweaks to the flight model in that transition between the hover and conventional flight. A revised external engine sound set would also be a huge improvement. It's probably not going to be an aircraft that you'll fly every day. In fact, it will probably be one of those products that you'll fly once or twice and then broadly leave in the hangar. But at this sort of price point, personally I do think it's worth a punt. It is good fun. I think you'll get a good few hours of enjoyment out of the aircraft. And the Do31 is so unique, such a beautiful visual model, that I imagine I will fly it from time to time within the sim. Once again, ladies and gents, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please do consider subscribing as well. And once more, if you would like to help support the channel further, you can do so by becoming a channel member or patron. I'll leave a link to both of those down in the video description below. And on that note, as always, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons. To all of you, I hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.